Hello everyone, and welcome to Designers at Home. I'm Mark Weaver. My guest today is from New York. Architectural Digest calls him the Metropolitan Museum star exhibition designer, Mr. Daniel Kershaw. So for the past 32 years, Daniel has been something of a design star, although it's unlikely you've heard of his name. His job is to develop the environments for the Met shows, making sure they establish the tone that the curator wants to convey. So Daniel's going to be chatting with us about the creative process of designing exhibitions. But first, I'd like to give you a little bio on Daniel. Daniel's a native of New York City, and prior to his work in museums, he apprenticed himself to cabinet maker Egg Tugel. He taught art at the Navajo Indian Reservation, studied industrial design and environmental analysis at Carnegie Mellon and Cornell universities. And after graduation, he went to work for the legendary furniture designer George Nelson. And he also spent 5 years in communications and advertising with the agency Saatchi & Saatchi. Daniel came to work at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as an exhibition designer in 1989. His designs include galleries for American paintings and sculptures, early medieval, Byzantium, Native American, and exhibitions of Renaissance portraits, arts of the samurai, Sero, and an exhibition, Play It Loud, Instruments of Rock and Roll. So Daniel, in addition to his duties at the Met, he consults with many other universities, institutions, museums, and later in our chat, he's going to tell us, hopefully we'll have the time, and he'll tell us a little bit about this. So he is going to join us in just a second. Let's see. I'm waiting to be let in. Okay. So we just had a test and it worked fine. So hopefully Daniel can join us. Let's see. Go live with Dan. Here it goes. It usually takes a few seconds to get us. Hi, Daniel.
Hi there. Greetings. Good to see you.
How are you? We finally got connected. So welcome. And I was just giving them a little bit of background on you, and I read a little bit about your bio. So, I wanted to ask you, how did your artistic interest develop? And what was it that inspired you into this profession?
Well, let's see. I guess, I've always drawn, carved things, made things since I was a little kid. I guess at some point early on, I realized that I wanted to make things that actually were sort of useful. And as you mentioned, I apprenticed myself as a young man to a Swedish luthier, a stringed instrument maker, and taught myself how to build acoustic instruments, stringed instruments. I found that incredibly rewarding, and I also found it's a great way for me to involve myself in something which was a combination of aesthetics and functionalism, which really has been my guiding principle ever since.
So you first interviewed at the Met in the 1980s, and I remember you saying you were hired 5 years later. So how did that happen?
Yeah, that was about the longest delay between interview and getting a job offer that I could possibly imagine. It really happened. My work at the time was for small museums around the city of New York, and working as an independent designer. And for me, when the economy kind of prevented a lot of museums from having much of an in-house staff or even being able to spend much on outside consultation, I went knocking on doors. And the first door that I knocked on, of course, was the Met. And the man who was in charge of the design department there, Jeff Daly at the time, said that there were really just about 3 exhibition designers in the whole museum, and we're not imagining that things will really change radically in the near future. He said, if somebody dies or moves away, I'll give you a call. And I kind of thought that that meant goodbye. I will never hear from you again. So I walked out the door thinking that was it. Even though we'd gotten along really well and it was a great interview, I was kind of shocked that 5.5 years later, Jeff called me up and said, fortunately, someone didn't die. They moved away. But I got the job offer a long delay after I'd actually gone in the front door. I think some of that's actually due to the fact that it's a small profession. It's a very limited area of expertise, and I'd kind of fallen in love with it. And there were so few people around that even though my portfolio was kind of slim at the time, he must have seen something in it that really caught his eye.
Well, you must have made a hell of an impression on them, because for somebody to keep your resume for 5 years and come back to you is remarkable. So, you know, the job that you do is very complex and it's collaborative. And you plan months in advance for shows. And you deal with a lot of forces just outside the museum. Also, you bring in other people involved. So, I was curious, you know, I would love to sit in with you and the team of people that you work with and watch the creative process, see how you go about creating this. So tell us and explain how you go about conceptualizing and creating the ideas for your exhibitions.
Well, the time frame varies enormously from, as you said, just a few months in advance, which is relatively rare, to many months in advance and possibly even many years in advance. And it's not uncommon for me to have a dozen or more exhibitions that I'm working on simultaneously, some of them quite soon and some of them several years away. So sometimes I'll be working on a design for an exhibition as long as 2 or 3 years before it actually occurs. And the exhibitions themselves are sort of ephemeral generally, although I do design permanent galleries as well. And the process really involves first a long conversation with the curator, trying to come up with a checklist of what the curator sees as being included in the exhibition and what the difficulties are of dealing with the story or stories that they want to be told. On top of that, it starts folding in more and more people, from graphic designers, lighting design, engineers, acousticians sometimes, digital specialists, security, the conservators and mount makers and climate control. And then it even blossoms on from there, as it does, I'm sure, in your profession, to include all the tradesmen involved in this thing, the carpenters, the painters, the specialists in plastics and stuff like that. So it expands exponentially as time goes on, with more and more people squeezed into my room or in the galleries.
Right. Well, you know, in my case, or in an architect, we're designing residences or office buildings, and there's a limited number of people. There are thousands of people that go through the Met on a daily basis to view the exhibitions you've created. So that's probably a big challenge, and you know, that's
well, that's a lot to think about. You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that's increasingly a concern of mine is dealing with crowds, or right now, social distancing between people.
Yes, because it's very different right now. There's is there a limited number of people that the museum allows in? And
absolutely, yeah. I was just in a meeting this morning about precisely that. Whether some of these exhibitions that I'm working on really make sense right now, whether some of them may need to even be delayed a little bit as the COVID cases increase again.
Right. So you've said that exhibition design is a delicate balance between enough and too much. And you know, you've done your best work when people are not looking at your work and it's not about you. So
yeah, ideally I design myself out of the picture.
Well, you know, we don't have time in this program which is limited to 30 or 40 minutes, to discuss all the things that it takes to design and all the types of exhibitions that you do. But the point of this, I want to make people aware of the time and the talent involved in creating these exhibitions, so that the next time that somebody goes to a museum, a gallery, wherever, they not only appreciate the work that is displayed, but how it is displayed, how it is lit, and how it's curated, because there's a tremendous amount of talent, your talent, and your designs and your team to create this. And hopefully this will make people look not just at one dimension, but how multidimensional this is.
Yeah, I think that's a great point of discussion. I find it's fascinating when you do walk people physically through the spaces that you've designed, and to be able to point out things that they would not have otherwise noticed. It may ruin the show for them a little bit because you're telling them the magic behind it, but I think it makes them look at things in a very different way when you realize that these things don't just sort of appear and stick themselves to the walls, that the walls weren't there. And one of the things that I find is incredibly rewarding is often working in the same spaces for years and years and reinventing it every time. So the galleries that I work in for any but the smallest shows typically have a decent amount of construction involved in them. And while I try to recycle as much as humanly possible and reuse things, inevitably a sculpture show goes in a space where paintings were, drawings go in where tapestries were, and whatever, or contemporary art goes where ancient art was. And the real fun is transforming that space three-dimensionally, architecturally. The path that people take through this space should vary so much that between visits, a frequent traveler to the museum should not even recognize that they're in the same space anymore.
Right, right, right. And I'm sure budget consideration is, one of the major concerns, and you're limited at times by costs.
Yeah, there are great things to be done that don't require vast, deep resources. Although many exhibitions have very specific requirements that do need some serious effort of construction, some complex planning that does cost money. Inevitably, you're able to be selective about that. Where do you spend the money wisely?
So I remember there was something very amusing about the Met. The architectural history of the Met spans more than a century. It involved 12 firms, 5 master plans, and it has 17 wings. And I remember something amusing that you had mentioned to me about uncovering one of the mysteries at the Met, architectural things.
Yeah, I like to consider myself the museum's archaeologist. I like excavating and digging into the walls of the building and finding things that have been tucked away and hidden behind walls, columns, arches, windows that had been buried there for years and years. One of the more fun things that I've had the chance to do is to carve out a space underneath the Great Hall stairs going up to the painting galleries, which no one, not even me, was aware of for the longest time. Turns out it was built originally as sort of a mop closet. Eventually, like many places in the museum, it emerged as a great place to store things that no one needed to get at for the immediate future. This was a place where electrotypes and other metalwork were stored in deep storage that were more scholars' reference than anything that would be shown to the public. I was surprised when one day I came upon a door hidden behind a case that was open into this little storeroom. And my eyes lit up, and it took a long time, many years, but I finally transformed it into a gallery for early Byzantine and pre-Byzantine art from the oases in northern Egypt, Saqqara, Bawit, places which the museum had had holdings in, but never had room to display before. And for me, the great joy is putting it in a place which looks like a crypt. The raw brickwork and the stone, the granite of the steps rising above your head. It's a space unlike any other one in the museum, and it jointly is a perfect way to show off this art as well as the history of the museum itself.
Right. So when you're designing and you're thinking about how you're going to create an exhibit, we're going to talk about a few of the exhibits that you've done, but does this just come naturally to you at this point? Because after 32 years, I mean, I'm assuming that, you don't have to think a lot about it, but does it just come from the gut? Is it how does this evolve?
I'd like to say that yes, it does come from the gut, but actually it takes a lot of labor and a lot of thinking. And once in a while, I kind of hit it right in the very beginning. The curator and I and all the other people who were involved in this kind of nail it from the absolute start of a project. More likely than not, though, it takes a lot of back and forth work. And many of these ideas, like for any creative person, don't emerge when I happen to be at work, sitting there in front of my computer, or even in the galleries. Many of these things occur as sort of these aha moments later on when I'm at home or doing some other activity. And I go, well, why didn't I think of that before? And some other concept comes to mind that really helps to transform it. So I'd say creativity strikes when it does, and you just sort of have to allow it to emerge in its own way.
Right. So one of the shows that you did, it was in 2015. It was titled "Where the Vast Sky Meets the Flat Earth: Framing Plains Indians," and that was an interesting show. And can you tell us a little bit about that exhibition?
Yeah, that was a remarkable exhibition, which included both ancient, archaic objects from the artists in the Great Plains, up until contemporary works. And so the problem for me was that Plains Indians are thought of as being a certain period in most of our visitors' minds, if they're thought of at all. The idea that these people still exist on their lands, still are incredibly creative, and their works reflect the land that they live in and their history is something that I think was surprising to many of our visitors. And I wanted to get that clear from the outset. So after a lot of thinking about how to frame this artwork, which is all light sensitive and can't really be exposed to blazing daylight, even if there were windows in this gallery, I decided I wanted to bring the Great Plains as the surrounding around the artwork. And after a great deal of work hunting around, I found a teenage girl on the Blackfeet Reservation who I bought cameras and filmed for, and she traveled to the far side of the reservation and photographed the sky, the turbulent sky in the distance, the vastness of the Great Plains. I blew the pictures up to a colossal scale, 20 feet high by 120 feet on the longest wall, wow, wrapping around the galleries. Mm-hmm. And it transformed it. It really meant that you were seeing the art in its setting, where it was meant to be seen, through the eyes of a native girl. And for me, this was really the moment that I wanted. We were very fortunate with the education department at the Met having come forth and provided this young lady with her first trip off of the reservation in her life, and flew her to New York and had a lunch and a dinner with Obama's representative of Native American Affairs. It was an incredible experience for this young lady as well.
So what was her reaction when she saw your exhibition?
She could not stop crying. It was truly something amazing. I don't think I've ever seen that many tears. She was just completely overwhelmed by the thing.
Well, that's exciting. That's very exciting. So now we can go in the other direction. And I happened to have seen this exhibition, and it was really thrilling. It was the rock and roll exhibition.
Right.
And I know you said that while most museums' installations are designed to spotlight the art and not steal the show, there are times when being awed by the installation itself is the whole idea. And rock and roll is sort of an in-your-face sort of thing. So this must have been quite a bit of a change from what your normal work is.
Yes, it definitely was a big change from normal, but one of the things that I like is that I don't really have a normal. So I'm sort of a specialist without a portfolio. I really do every sort of art imaginable, and I've done projects for musical instruments before, but you're right, this was its own unique thing, and sound featured tremendously into this. Being able to have audio which reflected the instruments that you were looking at was essential to the show to me. It also was essential that I have something which gets to what I felt was the moving, the emotional content that these instruments reflect. The fact that you're looking at, say, Bo Diddley's most legendary guitar, Jerry Lee Lewis's piano. I mean, these things were just incredible to have in front. Keith Richards' favorite instrument, which he kept borrowing back from the show because he couldn't live without it. So for me, one of the great moments was the fact that when Keith Richards would borrow his guitar back from the exhibition to play with it, we'd put a sign in the case saying, "We're really sorry this guitar returned to the artist right now, so it'll be back as soon as he's through with it." we found that people were Instagramming the sign more than they were the legendary instrument.
That's fascinating. So, what is, of the shows that you've created, say, in the last decade, what would be one of your favorite shows? What is the most
Wow.
memorable to you?
Um, the two that you mentioned definitely stand out, but other ones would include things like an exhibition which I designed a few years ago on pre-Columbian gold and precious materials, jade, gold, feathers, exotic materials, and following its course as gold in particular became an object of veneration from South America to Central America and Mexico during pre-Columbian times. So following the direction from south to north as this material transformed the Americas was really a remarkable thing. There too, I used some special effects in that gallery, particularly in a gallery of small Mayan bells which had been tossed into the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza. I built a circular room, projection mapped the moving dappled surface of the cenote waters below everyone's feet. And I think I mentioned to you earlier that for me, one of the revelatory moments was seeing a little child pretending to do the breaststroke across the floor of the gallery on the pretend water. But I also brought in, again, the sound there, because the gold bells in Mayan culture were more important for the sound that they made than the quality of the gold itself. The metal rang in a way that shell and stone did not. So for me, it was essential to have the sound of these bells. In this instance, I had an acquaintance of mine who's an ethnomusicologist at Princeton perform on them, and then mixed in a group of artists in Guatemala, Mayan artists performing traditionally on the bells. And that sound wafting through there just absolutely caught your breath.
Oh, that's incredible. So what do you think has been the museum's most successful show of recent years?
Recent years. Well, I mean, you go back, what's recent years? Obviously King Tut was the most successful on record. Some of
Okay.
our Costume Institute shows have been among the leaders there. So, the McQueen exhibition in the Costume Institute was definitely one of the biggest shows of all times in the museum. The rock and roll show really was pretty far up there. Play It Loud. We had, I think, 1/3 of a million visitors by the time that we closed see that show. For me, that's an incredible thing to know that 1/3 of a million people have been to see something that I've been a part of the design of. I think that just that really catches me.
Oh, that's exciting.
I think that for me the key is not just the quantities. I mean, it's not necessarily the best way to tell success is by how many people are seeing it, as much as really watching physically people's reactions when they're in a space.
Right.
So even quiet shows where not too many people have stumbled upon it, if you see somebody if you see a lot of people who are just swept away by the mood, the feeling that you've worked hard to convey about it, that's far more important than seeing cheek by jowl crowds in a space.
No, I agree with you. But one of the things that's interesting, say, about the rock and roll exhibition is that it probably brought in a lot of young people because of the subject that maybe wouldn't normally have come into the museum. And it exposes them to many of the other wonderful shows and what else the museum has to offer. I know when I go to the Met, two of my favorite places to go, I always visit the Egyptian wing, just Egyptian history is, one of my passions. And my most favorite is the Greco-Roman,
Right.
with the beautiful sculptures and antiquities. So those exhibitions don't really change, do they?
Well, they do, and that's what's interesting about it. So there's a funny misnomer that we're to blame for. We describe things as temporary exhibits, which typically in museum parlance means that they last for 3 months to 6 months, once in a while longer, maybe up to a year. And then there's what we think of as, or describe as, permanent galleries in the museum. And permanent galleries get renovated periodically in a grand way, depending upon funding, depending upon the need of the museum. Sometimes they last for 15, 20 years the way that they are. Sometimes they last for 100 years, more or less the way that they are. The more or less is the key word there, because a permanent gallery actually is anything but permanent. A temporary exhibit, typically you design, and it looks the way when it opens and the same way when it closes, with a few exceptions of things that are light sensitive and may need to be rotated off. A permanent gallery is the opposite of that. A permanent gallery, if it's done properly, is so flexible that it anticipates what the aesthetics of the future will be. So you have to think of, is that color one thing that's going to be beautiful at the moment, but a few years from now, are people going to cringe when they see it?
Right.
Is that particular technique for designing something, this way that seems so apt for the art, something which is going to be hopelessly dated in the future? Or even more than that, is your design going to restrict the way that the museum, which is a very active collecting and changing and intellectual environment, is that going to prevent a future curator from switching up things, moving things around, taking things off exhibit and putting other things on display? Or a new acquisition which comes in, which just has to have a home in there? Is your design going to be so locked in that it's going to stop them from doing that? If so, then a permanent gallery design is not a success, even though it may look it at first.
Right. So let's talk for a minute about the upcoming shows. I know you have quite a bit in the works. Are you at liberty to talk about some of the upcoming shows the Met has?
Sure.
That you're going to be working with?
Happily. I've got a slew of them coming up in the future. I'm hoping that that they all come to pass. I'm meeting this morning about a beautiful exhibition on Goya, with a lot of loans from the Prado and other international bodies. Very difficult at this time to tell what is going to happen with being able to borrow artwork in the next few months. I'm not really sure what's going to happen in the world, and that's something we're trying to really cope with. Working on a major exhibition on the Medici, on Cosimo de' Medici and his immediate successors, and the founding of the Medici reign in Italy, with portraits and politics being the key points of that. So it's a particularly apt thing where there's murder and mayhem and all sorts of conniving going on politically, as well as on the sculptures and paintings portraying the Medici rulers as the heroes that they wanted to be portrayed as, or the villains that other people saw them as. So it's an interesting political statement that I think is going to be quite remarkable.
Great. So at this time of COVID, a lot of people, obviously we're not at liberty to travel and so forth right now, but the museum is accessible online. People can see these exhibitions. How do people go about? They just go online and connect to Metropolitan Museum of Art? Is that?
Yeah, the Met website has a increasingly, not that it wasn't impressive before, but increasingly lively online presence right now. And so I would say that that's a great way to look at things. Certainly nothing is quite the same as being there next to the artwork in the spaces that I and other of my colleagues have designed. But online, it's a pretty robust presence right now. And often there's a relatively complete catalog online of all the artwork with texts available for it. Often, as not, there are even in-gallery guided tours, which the museum has, of curators and artists and others walking through the spaces, describing the impact it has on them. So we continue to do that, which is, I think, really quite wonderful. I was just part of a recording which the museum is doing in honor of its 150th anniversary for a special which will be broadcast a little later this year by BBC and PBS, talking about the museum and its history. I'm not sure how much of me will end up on the cutting room floor, but I'm imagining that I'll be in there a number of times talking about some of the galleries. So stay tuned for that when that comes out.
Well, it's great because, a lot of people are stuck at home. They're wondering what to do. And this is a great way to explore the Met because there's always something exciting there. So earlier, while I was reading your bio, I was talking about some of the other institutions, museums, and galleries that you consult with. And I don't know how, with your responsibilities at the Met, you possibly have time. But I mean, it would take me 5 minutes, 10 minutes to go through the list of institutions you consult with. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I've always found time and enjoyed working for other institutions, looking at other ways that other museums and other academic places have a very different take on how the art is to be displayed. Their needs are quite different from the museums often. And I've often found that really stimulating. I like working on a lot of outside projects too. I do this on weekends, evenings, whenever I can squeeze it in on top of my day job, my much more than day job at the Met. So yeah, I have for a long time been working on quite a few other projects. I continue to do, designing 2 exhibitions right now for the Jewish Museum in New York. I have several things going on in other places across the country, which I find really fascinating to work on. I've for years did consultation. I designed every exhibit for the Onassis Foundation in New York. So I too have a deep love for classical antiquity.
Right.
Let's see, I've redesigned Yale University Art Gallery's museum exhibitions and permanent galleries in maybe an 8 or 9 year project that I worked on with them. I find these really rewarding, and I find it interesting also that the different audiences that these different institutions have a direct impact on how the art is presented.
Right. Absolutely. So you work, I know you work endlessly. So do you have any spare time at all?
I do.
So
I definitely do
tell
have
us
spare
what you
time.
do in your spare time to get yourself sort of relaxed and centered so that you can remain creative.
Well, I've long been an avid swimmer. I'm also passionate about canoeing and kayaking. I'm a
Hmm.
sailor. I spent a little bit of time uh, not that long ago sailing, even with friends. Even though the lockdown was there, we all tested ourselves before going on the boat. So these are all strong passions of mine. You know, outdoors, hiking. These are things which really warms my heart. Living in Manhattan means that I do have a hunger to be in nature and to be outside. So even while Central Park is just outside over there, I like to get much further out into the woods than
Yeah,
that.
I'm the same way. I find nature very healing, and it also it's great. It gives you a different perspective, and then when you start work again, you're fresh and alive and invigorated.
Right.
So
Absolutely. Yeah.
being in
Yeah.
nature is very nurturing.
Yeah.
So you know, there's so much we could talk about. I'd love to hear about more exhibitions. We're limited with time, unfortunately. So to close, I'd like to read a quote from you. Quote, from a very young age, I was fascinated with design. There's something of that same kid-like rapture that this job evokes as you're dealing with the most important and extraordinary objects from our culture and history. And so after 32 years at the Met, you're still feeling that rapture.
Absolutely true. I love
So,
going to work every day. I sure missed it when we were locked down, but at this point, I'm going back 2 or 3 days a week when needed, and for me, that makes me very happy.
well, it's really a privilege and an honor to talk with you.
Thank
I
you. The
really
same here, Mark.
appreciate you taking the time, and I hope this has made people appreciate your work and what you do, and not just look at art, but look at how it's presented the next time they're in an exhibition. So
Thank you
thank you
so
so
much.
much, Daniel. I
All
hope
right.
you'll join us again in the future.
I look forward to it.
All right. Oops, now let me get to, I hope you all enjoyed our visit with Daniel. I find him incredibly fascinating. He's a lovely guy. So my next guest is going to be in 2 weeks on December 4th, and I'm going to take you to Shangri-La. We're going to be talking to the curator of collections and exhibitions at Shangri-La located in Honolulu. We'll be speaking with Leslie Mickelson. Shangri-La is the estate of tobacco heiress, philanthropist, and socialite Doris Duke. So I hope you join us. It's going to be a lot of fun. So, this year we've had over 22 guests on Designers at Home. We've had architects, designers, sculptors. We've spoken with museums, all areas of design. And I hope you've enjoyed them. So please share these with your friends. Tell them about our talks And you can visit us on Instagram, you can visit us on YouTube, and now our podcast is active. It's all under Mark Weaver and Associates. So from the wonderful world of design, I'm Mark Weaver. Thank you for joining us at Designers at Home.